Hi guys, welcome back. Next video of my online tailoring course. The last video we cut out all our panels, so we're on our way to construction. You should have back panel, obviously with all the tailor's tacks in place, two separate pieces ready to go. You'll have your middle panel, again tailor tacked ready, your front panel all good to go, and your upper and lower sleeve panels. Now you'll note that there's no tailor's tacks all the way around these because the pattern pieces are as. We've not added any extra cloth like we did to the other panels. All I've done is I've put some tailor tacks for the notches, top of the arm, back notch and the underarm. So they're all good, ready to go. Now, before we start sewing things together, there's a really important step, and this video is all about it, and that's ironworking. We're taking two-dimensional cloth, obviously it's got curves and shapes, and we're going to sew it together to form a three-dimensional garment. But we need to ironwork, and by that I mean use the iron, steam, to shape these panels. We're going to stretch the fabric in a few areas, and we're going to shrink the fabric in a few areas, and what it does is it gives you an extra dimension to the cloth before you actually start construction. When you then start putting all these panels together, you will end up with a really crisp finish. It's all about managing the human body in cloth. For example, the back panel, we're going to stretch just a small amount over the shoulder area because obviously our shoulder blades stick out a little bit, and that will just stop the cloth from pulling at the centre back seam or the back of the arm seam. We'll stretch a little bit on the waist, and you might think stretching on the waist is just going to make the waist baggy, but what it will do is it will stop the waist seam from puckering when you're moving. So there's a few little techniques that we're going to do. The first thing I'm going to do is demonstrate how we do it, and then I'll show you on each panel exactly what you need to do. Okay, quick demonstration on stretching or shrinking your cloth. I've cut a piece of wool fabric here. The grain line is running this way, so that's our warp threads. Our weft threads are running this way, and I've just chalked on some guidelines just so you can see how things stretch or shrink. Each one of these squares is 6 centimeters, and the width of the fabric is 24 centimeters. Put a ruler on just to make sure that the edges are nice and straight, which they are. Obviously different fabric will stretch or shrink differently, so it's always good to test it on the cloth that you're going to be using. Cut off a scrap and just have a little try. A thicker, heavier woolen cloth will probably stretch and shrink more than a very tightly woven cloth. So all we need is obviously our iron. I like to set the temperature. I never really go by the guidelines or the markings on the iron. I generally go up to the next level, so rather than wool I'll go up to cotton. It's all about getting the steam into the cloth, which will help you when you come to shaping. I've got my dauber, which is just a piece of wool wrapped up into a little cylinder, a little tub with my water in, distilled water, and it's got a few drops of pure spearmint oil in, so that's my aqua water. Squirty bottle with exactly the same, just some water in, and you can use these to concentrate where you want to get your steam. The steam from a steam iron is great, however sometimes you end up putting too much steam into the cloth. So using either the dauber or the spray bottle, you can concentrate it to just one area, which is quite important when we come to shape things. A press cloth is always good. Certainly for ironworking, you will always work on the reverse of the cloth, the wrong side of the cloth, so as you don't make any marks. But if you're worried, use a press cloth as well, just to be really careful. If you ever press on the right side of the cloth, always use a press cloth. I like to use the cloth made out of a similar material that I'm working on. So if I'm working with wool, I'll use a wool press cloth. If I'm working on silk, I'll use a silk press cloth. Cotton, a cotton press cloth, and so on. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch this area of the cloth. So I can either spray an area like so, plenty of liquid on there, and then I'm going to take the iron, and you'll generate the steam straight away. What I'm going to do is I'm going to push the cloth towards the iron, and I'm pressing down quite hard, like so, and straight away you won't be able to see it yet, but that's already started to stretch outwards. I'm going to work back the opposite way. So again, let's use the dauber this time. I just want to concentrate on this area, and it's a case of just getting the liquid on exactly where you want it. So I'm going to work across, and this time I'm going to bring the fabric towards the iron this way, which is difficult to see on the camera. And again, I'm pressing hard onto the cloth to stretch it. I'll come back this way again. Now this cloth hasn't been pre-shrunk. The only thing I did to it was I pressed it very lightly on a warm setting on the iron, just to get any wrinkles, which I've mentioned before, I think in the last video. You don't want to shrink the cloth because you need to be able to shrink it and stretch it. So I think we're nearly there. Like I say, it's a bit of practice because you want to make sure that you don't overstretch your cloth. Like so. Now if I put the ruler back on and straighten up the edge of the cloth, like so, you'll see a distinct bulge, and this is where I've stretched the cloth in this area. And this would be used, for example, on your shoulder blades, on your back panels. You'll stretch an area so it conforms to the shape of your shoulder blades. So there we go, you can see how much we've stretched. And if I flatten it out, take the tape measure and measure it, it was 24 centimetres, 6, 6, 6 and 6. We've now got 25 centimetres. So I've put in about a centimetre's worth of stretch this way. Of course you can do it this way as well, and it's the same procedure. For shrinking the cloth, the technique is the same, apart from we don't push the iron down onto the cloth. We use the iron very, very lightly. Again, squirt the area you want, or use your dauber, or of course use the steam from your iron. And this time I'm literally, and you can see I'm holding the iron really lightly, I'm going to start just touching the cloth and going round in circles. And it's just generating a little bit of steam. Like so. If you want to use the steam on your iron, Put plenty of steam on. And get our circles smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So work out how you want to shrink your cloth. So I'm just touching, I've tilted the iron slightly. I'm literally just rubbing this edge on the cloth and then come back the other way. More steam. Quite often it's easier to shrink the cloth than it is to stretch it. So I say have a practice on some similar fabric that you're going to be using. You can see a few ripples there, plenty of steam, and lightly small circles, shrink them out. The key to a good tailored garment is the shape of the cloth, and you know we're using two-dimensional cloth that has to fit over a three-dimensional body. So the ironworking is a really important part for the final look of the finished garment. Okay, you probably can't see it very well because you're looking at a slight angle. I can't really line the edges up now because this edge will be shrunk inwards. What I can do is measure my 6cm squares and then now down to 5.5 centimetres, 5.6 centimetres. So I've lost, just in this area, I've lost nearly a centimetre in the cloth. So again, we've got the extra stretch at the top and we've shrunk the bottom area. I hope that's clear. When we come to do the actual garment pieces, it will make a lot more sense. Okay, let's start on one of the back panels. Remember, you have to do each panel individually, so we'll repeat this process for the other panel. Working on the reverse of the cloth, the wrong side of the cloth, you can always tell because your tailor's tacks will have the long legs, and on the other side you'll have the little short legs, so that's the right side of the fabric. What we're going to do is we're going to add some ease just below the lower edge of where the sleeve comes in. We're going to add a little bit of ease, so we're going to stretch the fabric out in this area. I'm going to mark roughly where I would do it, and I'm not using chalk because remember what I said, chalk is horrible to get rid of. I'm going to use some Tailor's soap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in this area, you can just see those lines, I'm going to stretch it out. We're not going to go perhaps 4 centimetres, 1.5 inches below this area, and we're not going to go any higher than our top of our shoulder. We're going to come down about the same amount. So it's literally this area we're going to work on. Now Tailor's soap vanishes as soon as you start working with it with heat, so those marks will disappear in the next step. I want to concentrate just on this area, so I'm going to use my dauber and I'm going to get the cloth, plenty of water on the cloth. Like so. You can tell it's nice virgin wool because the water sits on the top quite well. So remember the same technique that I just showed you. We're going to put the iron on, we're going to push the cloth towards the iron, and we're putting some weight onto the cloth. I'm just going to stretch it out. like so. Now you might not think that's done a huge amount, but the easy way to check is to place your original pattern onto the cloth, and you'll notice that the lines are sticking out slightly. If they're not, work a little bit more. So we'll stretch a little bit more of this. Be careful that you don't hook your tailor's tacks out with the tip of your iron. Like so. And you'll start to see a bit of a bulge appearing in this area. Again, check with your pattern piece. You'll see, obviously the pattern piece is flattening the fabric, but you can see that you haven't changed the shape of the pattern piece. All you've done is given this area a little bit more ease. So that's the first step for the back. Next step, we're going to work on this shoulder seam, and all we're going to do is going to shrink it very slightly. We're not going to go past our actual stitching line, which is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch away from our tailor's tacks. So if you just draw a line, but if you think about there, you're not going to go into this part of the cloth. You're literally going to shrink this very, very small area here. Again, we're not doing massive amounts, but our back shoulder seam is longer than our front. So we're going to, as I told you just before, lightly press, well, not even press really, you're just holding the iron onto the cloth just to get that amount of steam in. Shrink that in. Now obviously this pattern, or this fabric's got a pattern because it's got the pinstripe. You can always measure this there, there and there, and you'll see there is a slight difference in the width of the pinstripe. Don't go mad. The last thing you want to do is distort the, any pattern that you've got on your cloth. You don't want your pinstripe suddenly doing this or shrinking to nothing. So be careful as you do it, and it comes with practice. I think that's probably about right, like so. 2 more bits on the back panel. Waistline is about inch and a half, 4 centimeters above our top of our vent. Just going to mark roughly there. This curve and this curve, when you sew the seam and the seam is pressed open, the fabric edge is shorter on this side, so what we need to do is stretch the inlay, or the extra bit of fabric we added, out slightly. We're not stretching this seam line, the same with this side. So all we're going to do is gently stretch this out, so when we fold that seam and press it open, there's no puckers. This is where the dauber comes in really useful, because you can target a very small area. So I'm using the tip of the iron like so. Just gently get rid of any wrinkles that I've just created in the back, and you'll notice this now has a slight ripple to it, but when that is then sewn and pressed over, it will lay flat, which is exactly what we want. And we'll repeat that for this inward curve here. So we're only going to come up to about there. You've got to be careful you don't drag your tailor's tacks out, so take your time. And now we'll see we've got just a gentle amount of ripple in this cloth, so it's lifting up from the ironing board, and that will help give us a final finish when we sew it up. We can repeat the same for the other back panel. Add the bit in the shoulder, stretch these two and shrink along the shoulder seam. Okay, the side panel doesn't really need a lot of work. We're going to come up just from the vent, so similar to we did on the back, 1.5 inches, thereabouts, 4 centimeters, and we're just going to come in about that far, 3 inches, 7.5 centimeters or so, and we're just going to stretch this little area again. Okay, not going into or past our actual stitching line, which is 1 centimeter. We're just going to stretch this curve outwards so it puckers up, so that when it's folded over it will lie flat. Again, put your water on. Just be careful of your tailor's tacks. And there we go, you can see that the edge of the cloth is riding up on both sides. And that's all you need to do for the side panel. Repeat that for the other piece. Okay, onto the front panel. We're going to go from the top of the dart there, and we're going to stretch this area this way and this way. We're not going to go too close. It was probably to the top of our lapel, so no higher than that. We're not going to go into the lapel roll line. We're going to come back at least 2.5, 3 centimeters, inch and a quarter, thereabouts. And we're not going to get too close to our armhole at the front. If you stretch too much here, this can affect this curve on the armhole, so just be careful. Again, about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters. So just this area we're going to stretch slightly in both directions. Okay, and you'll see the cloth ripple up because obviously there's now a shape under here. The lapel roll line, we want to actually shrink this because have you ever seen somebody wearing a suit where their jacket opens at the chest? We're going to shrink this very slightly because we're going to also, when we construct it, we're going to put some special tacks in here that you won't see that will effectively give us a dart to make sure that this part of the lapel or the roll line fits over the chest. So again, a little bit of water, and we're just going to shrink this out by only just holding the iron onto the cloth. I'm not going to the full extent of the roll line. I'm coming up 4/5, I guess, something like that. We're just going to shrink this little bit out. Again, you'll start to see ripples appearing. Don't worry. The first time I ever did this, I thought I'd messed everything up. But when you start putting it together, you'll see how it works. Okay, so we've stretched this area over the chest. We've shrunk this area, which is going to be the lapel, so it curves into the chest nicely. We need to shrink just a little bit around, so from the front notch about halfway up on our front sleeve area, and we are only shrinking a tiny amount. We're not going to go past the actual stitching line, which again 1 centimetre from our tailor's tacks. We're just going in like so. It just means you don't get any puckers when you set your sleeve in. There we go. Shoulder seam, we're going to stretch. Again, this is for when it's opened out. We want it to lie flat. It is on not quite the bias. There is some stretch there, and what you don't want is it to stretch all out of place and you end up with puckers along your shoulder seam. A little bit of water. We're not going to stretch much, just a tiny amount. So, and the last bit we're going to do on the front panel is the side seam where it joins to the side panel, and we're just going to stretch this curve like we've done for the last couple, because obviously we want it to be going this way when it's stitched. So put some water on there. Again, we're not going into or anywhere past the stitching line. Again, you can see it pucker up, which means it will lie flat when we press everything open. Okay, that's the front panel done. Again, repeat it for the other front panel. If you've got a jacket that doesn't have a displaced dart, like this one where it disappears outside, if you've got one that has a double-ended dart that finishes either at the top of the pocket or it might go below the pocket if you've got a patch pocket, you can shrink below, so like you stretched at the top, you can shrink very slightly below the other end of the dart. Just gives you a bit more shape around the front of your hips. It's one thing to experiment with, but it works every time. Okay, so that's our front panel done. Okay, finally onto the upper sleeve. There are no tailor's tacks, as I've said before, so I've made sure I've drawn a cross on the wrong side of the fabric. All we're going to do is let's move it over, the inner curve, which will be the seam sort of underarm. We're going to stretch that like we've done with the last few panels, so that when the seam is stitched, it's not going to cause any puckers. So pop some water on, just give it a quick stretch, and we're not going, you know, this is a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, so don't go any more than that. And all you want it to do is just ripple up, and then, you know, when that's folded over, it's going to be a much neater flat seam. Around the top of the sleeve head, like so, we're going to shrink this, and we're only going to shrink it by a small amount. Setting in sleeves can be tricky, but if we just shrink a little bit out, it will make things a lot better, and you won't end up with any puckers at all. Again, we're not going any more than a centimetre on this because it's a centimetre seam allowance. So just slightly small circles. If you want to use your steam on your iron, carry on. Remember, when you're shrinking, you're only just touching the iron to the cloth. You're not pushing it down, you're not pressing against the cloth. Like so. Now what you won't see in the video is the fact that the cloth is curled slightly. Might be able to see a little bit there, which is exactly what you want, because you've shrunk this area, which is going to make it a lot easier when you come to set your sleeve. So that's the upper sleeve done. We can go on to the undersleeve. Okay, undersleeve, again, cross marked because this is the wrong side, as there's no tailor's tacks. All we need to do is this curve, which is opposite our vent. So this is the inside curve, the inside seam, and we're just going to stretch this out like so. So it puckers along this edge. When it's sewn, you'll get a nice crisp finish to your seam. Again, 1.5, or again 1.5 centimeters. This is 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on the sleeve. You're not going to go any more than that. You're not going to go the whole length. You're going to go just below the top of the vent, and you're going to come down 3 inches, 7.5 centimeters from the top, and we're just going to stretch this out, so when it folds over, it's nice and flat. So get the water on. like so, and you can see that it's sitting up from the cloth. There you go. So that's our panels ironworked. So do both fronts, both backs, both sleeves, top and bottom, and obviously the side panels. The next video, we're actually going to start some real construction. We're going to look at how to construct a balanced dart on the front panels, and we'll also put in our welt chest pocket. So until next time, I'll see you soon.